I will tell you about the most boring subject of the day, which is ICS asset management and as it relates to OT security. Sorry, but it's got to be done anyway. In case you do have any questions, criticism, you want to contribute to the event, please interrupt me at any time. Do not wait until the end of the session. Just raise your hand or go to a mic and shoot it at me right away. Don't be shy. So what could asset management have to do with ICS security? You may have heard this quote from a quite famous quantum physicist, Mr. Schrödinger, Erwin Schrödinger, and he said, until somebody observes it, it is just a probability. Can you relate to that in the context of OT security? Well, you should, because when you do a risk assessment, the fact basis that you have actually observed usually is extremely thin. And how do we know that? How can we figure that out rather quickly? Just as an example, can you tell me, for those of you who work for asset owners, how many Rockwell PLCs you have in your installed base? No, you can't? Okay, then let's just try something else. How many Windows PCs do you have running Windows 7 or earlier, meaning like outdated, out of end of support? How many would that be? No idea? Okay, then let's try something more simpler. How many devices overall? Oh, no, that might still be too difficult. How many networks do you operate? You don't know that either? I think that would be pretty important to know, right, when you make any considerations about your cyber risk. And remember, we are not even talking about how those networks are interconnected, if all these firewall rules are configured properly, etc. So that is bad. Anyhow, let's step back one more step. How many sites, how many factories are we talking about? Oh, you don't know that either? Oh, that's funny. Then we need to fully start from scratch. In respect to the last question, you might think I'm making this up, but I don't. So I actually was in that situation a couple of years ago when I pretty much went through those same questions with a client back in the years when I was doing consulting. And so at some point in time, I just put out the very simple question, well, how many facilities are we talking about? And the answer was, that's a good question. That always tells you they have no clue. It could be somewhere between 800 and 900, so certainly more than 10. So at least they had a ballpark figure. But if you are in such an environment where you're not talking about facts but only guesswork, that's a very bad position for your risk assessment, because you are only talking about hunches and probabilities. And why is that a problem? Because that risk equation, at the end of the day, already has a number of factors in it that are very speculative. So you can anticipate that your end result might be challenged. And that gets us to the next and last quote for this session. Without data, you're just another person with an opinion. Does anybody know who said that? Walter Edwards Deming, the father of quality management. Nobody wanted to listen to Deming, and so he went to Japan and told the Japanese automobile companies how to do it right. And then a couple of years later, Toyota, etc., took over the worldwide automobile market. This is what happens when you don't listen to the smart people. So, why is that a problem when you don't have data? Because, and this might be one of the most fundamental insights for you students today, at the end of the day, it's not about all those hackers and vulnerabilities, it's about getting the budget. You have to make the point to your management. And if you cannot present hard data, hard facts, you will be just another guy with an opinion. and you won't get that budget, and your OT security case is closed. And this is not a position you want to be in. So the best strategy to avoid that trap is that you come fully prepared to that meeting with your boss, with management, that you can really make your case. Because you're not only telling them, well, I think we really have quite a bunch of vulnerabilities. That's a very weak argument. If you could say, well, we know for a fact, and here are the specific details that we are talking about, let's just say 53,000 critical known vulnerabilities in our installed base. And that is something, that is a number that today you can pull rather easily with using automation. So you don't need to send a weasel through all your networks and have the weasel figure out where the vulnerabilities would be. This can be automated. This is the data that you need in order to make your case. If you put it into the big context of risk management, you could say that the inventory ultimately is the what, the subject that we are talking about. Whereas the vulnerabilities define the how this subject could be attacked. If you don't know the what, you cannot secure your environment. Funny thing is, if the attacker doesn't know the what, he won't be able to attack that environment, other than just poking around, just doing random ping sweeps and see what they can get. But for the more sophisticated attacks, the attacker will always need to have a model of what they're trying to attack. And basically you could say they are doing a system inventory if they are planning to do something more sophisticated and interesting. So we have the inventory, we have the vulnerabilities, and the threats basically define the when. When will those vulnerabilities be exploited? The vulnerabilities are there, and most of you are just plain lucky that they haven't been exploited yet. That's good, right? Because we know as a fact that you have so many vulnerabilities, you are so exploitable, but so far no hacker bothered to actually give it a try because you're not interesting enough, or because the hackers are just a lazy bunch of bitches. That is something that I'm really getting this feeling, because if you think about all those vulnerabilities in our space, and I'm not talking about the known vulnerabilities, I'm talking about the much more severe vulnerabilities by design, for which you won't find a CVE. But apparently, they're just too lazy to get their act together and buy some stuff on eBay, a couple of PLCs, and then just play around, do proof of concept, and then let it loose. That is the rare exception from the norm. That happened, for example, a couple of times in history, for example, with the recent attack in, not so recent, in Saudi Arabia, where you would imagine, or let's just say you have indications that hackers actually did a proof of concept up to the very extreme situation that we have seen with Stuxnet, where the attackers had an operational facility built up. That is the extreme. Okay, so the threats are the when. When will it happen? And then besides those real-world attacks or potential attacks, we also have configuration drift. And that is kind of like a random, more or less random change in your configurations that usually also makes things worse, makes the configuration even more vulnerable. In a nutshell, asset management is an asset inventory plus a couple of workflows for analyzing and manipulating those items on top. So the asset inventory basically is your artifact. that you absolutely need for the data in order to analyze this installation that you intend to protect. And for the attacker is the artifact, where the attacker can figure out promising vulnerabilities and attack paths. And then on top of the asset inventory, there are a couple of workflows such as vulnerability management or such as change management that also belong in this big box that we call asset management. So in a way, the asset inventory is the core of our small universe. It is the fact base. It is the artifact. It tells us what we have. It tells us about all the configurations. We can analyze this database of configurations. And the planets that spin around this sun, this asset inventory, those are the workflows, such as change management, vulnerability management, governance, risk and compliance, factory acceptance test, site acceptance test, obsolescence management. Why is that a thing? What could it have to do with OT security? Well, what about Windows 7? I'm just saying, basically all of you should have been super busy until last week, because then was the big day when Windows 7 had end of support, and everybody could have seen that, could have anticipated that a couple of years ago. Everybody could have made their upgrade projects, could have completed their upgrade projects, and this is what it have looked like in a perfect world. And because it's not a perfect world, you're all sitting here with our vulnerable Windows 7 boxes. Then there is also this little planet here, this little blue planet, and that's where the hackers live, okay? As I said earlier, the hackers also need an asset inventory. And sometimes I wonder if the better hackers have quite a decent asset inventory for their targets. Because usually the asset owner, the victim, has nothing. Because let me make this clear right away before I forget. If you tell me that you have a couple of Excel spreadsheets, no. That is not an asset inventory. Just forget it. And why is that not an asset inventory? Any ideas? It is absolutely, completely outdated. It is incomplete. Usually what you see in such an Excel spreadsheet is a bunch of host names and IP addresses. Best case, you also see an operating system version. But for example, what about the software configuration? What about any security patches installed or not installed? Well, problem is you can't put that in an Excel spreadsheet. And certainly the bigger problem is when we talk about asset inventory, let me be very clear on this. We are only talking about an inventory that is automatically maintained. You cannot do that by hand. People, look at me. This is important. Stop even trying or pretending. You cannot do this manually. Stop doing that. Tell your boss instead, boss, I'm sorry, it doesn't work, and I can even show you why. Okay? You don't have an asset inventory if you come with a bunch of Excel spreadsheets. Okay, so the hackers also need such an inventory. And now let's look at how asset inventory fits into frameworks such as the NIST cybersecurity framework. Unfortunately, they put it in there in a box. And I say unfortunately because this is not quite realistic. It's not quite correct because it would give you the impression, well, it's just another of those little colorful boxes in the NIST CSF. If you think it through, it is much more than just that tiny box, because for many of all these activities within the NIST CSF, you definitely need asset management and an asset inventory. Okay? Because otherwise, none of these other activities have a reasonable chance to be executed successfully. Let me give you an example. So here we have, here we have risk management. How would you be able to do risk management without an asset inventory? It's not possible. Then in the protection column, we have protective technology. Well, that sounds cool, right? But what does it mean? It would mean, for example, all the security patches you have installed or have not installed, okay? How would you know? How could you analyze how many security patches you have, how many are missing? Well, the answer is that's what an asset inventory tells you. You can run analytics on these data. If you cannot do that, you don't have a protective technology, even if you call it that way. So the reality is when we look at real-world data, when it comes to patches, you will be shocked. And I promise you, once that you introduce an asset management system, you will see things like vulnerabilities and patches with new eyes. You will be shocked to learn about all those hundreds of thousands of vulnerabilities that you have not patched. And this is an insight that you get rather quickly because you just have to look at the patch numbers. And this is something that an asset inventory tells you. So for example, if you add up all the patches that you have done in the past for all your Windows boxes, a number is going to result, right? And if that number for all your devices is, let's just say, 117 per month. Oh, last month it was only 73, but maybe we'll get better next month. Anyhow, by just looking at these numbers, you will know right away as a fact that you don't have any patch management. That this organization, where you see such a picture, has only been doing patches randomly and anecdotally, which happens very often. So often it goes like this. Some new vulnerability is getting so much attention that it hits the mainstream media. Or for those of you who are on Twitter, well, now everybody is talking about that new vulnerability in respect to Microsoft Windows with the elliptic curve cryptography, right? I think everybody in that room has heard about that. And sometimes now this triggers a patch event. And that's bad, because that should only be one little blip on your radar, on your patching radar. You have so many more vulnerabilities that you would need to patch. And you don't know about those, and you don't know about those that you have patched without an asset management system. And there are other areas in the NIST CSF where asset management comes in. It affects detection. So for example, when you think about detection, let's just say you do have this indicator of compromise. Wow, now you got them. You got these sons of bitches and you're going to nail them down. How do you know that you're seeing the full picture? So for example, if I am your SOC guy, your OT SOC guy, the first thing that I would like to know when I see, well, this is an indicator of compromise, is this the full story? Or are these sons of bitches anywhere else in my networks? Well, certainly if you don't even know how many networks you have, and especially how many networks would have a very good chance of being compromised already using the same attack vector, then your detection and response effort will be severely limited. So that's another example how asset management will boost your performance throughout this cycle. And it certainly also has to do with recovery, because an asset management system is the perfect place where you would have your incident response plans, your contingency plans, etc., for every specific device and system. Now let's go a little bit more into depth and let's look at the various items or data fields that you expect to find in an asset inventory. First, it's about hardware, so you would want to know things like the ones I mentioned when I started. PLCs, so Rockwell PLCs, which model is there? Are there any PLCs with a safety certification? You would like to know that. You would want to be able to do analytics specifically on those PLCs that are safety certified. You want to learn about hardware configuration. What is in those PLCs? Or think about communications adapters in the Rockwell/Ethernet IP space. What is connected to those interfaces? Show me all the various modules on the backplane or in the rack. That is all stuff that you will find in an asset management system, and that will largely drive your protection efforts. And the good news is, once that you introduce such a database, your engineers will get very curious, because that is something that they always wanted to have. Because they certainly are not happy with those damn Excel spreadsheets either. Then the other thing you want to see in that asset inventory is the software configuration. We have discussed that already. For example, which operating system versions are you using? Any outdated operating systems in there? Oh yeah, a whole lot of outdated operating systems. What about software applications? Did you know that there are a handful of software applications that have this magic power, like dark holes in the universe? They attract all this dark energy and antimatter, all the vulnerabilities and all the hackers. There are these handful of software applications. Who has an idea? Who can name one? Java? Yeah, Java is not an application, but in principle you are right. I'm afraid I cannot hear you because, and it doesn't, don't bother to use the mic. Let me give you another example. Adobe Flash Player. Oh, so that could be the most useful takeaway for many of you in this room. Go home and deinstall Adobe Flash Player. That might be your most significant contribution to OT security over the last year. And I mean, think about it. So if you look at the vulnerabilities, Adobe Flash Player is always very high in the list, and especially for those critical vulnerabilities with a CVSS score, base score of 10. And then it really gets interesting when you ask the question, well, why? Why Adobe Flash Player? Do we need that? I mean, is Adobe Flash Player in this environment, does it run any critical process? Is it safety related, or what is it? And usually the answer is no, nobody needs that piece of shit. So let's just deinstall it, and then all of a sudden, boom, your vulnerabilities go down. And the best thing is your patching requirements also go down, because as long as you're dragging these bastards along, your patching requirements are much, much higher, because every single month there will be new critical vulnerabilities for things like Adobe Flash Player or Adobe Reader. Try to get rid of those applications that shouldn't be installed on computers in the factory space in the first place.
Hey, Ralph?
Yes?
The additional metadata, are we putting passwords in that too?
I would not do that. But I have heard that some people even put passwords in Excel spreadsheets. Isn't that funny? And by the way, some of the old folks, experienced folks in this room, I think I'm the only old old guy here, right? Some may remember that in real-world attacks such as Black Energy, the attackers were actively pulling Excel spreadsheets and notepad files, TXT documents. Why? Because those were professionals. They knew where to find these passwords. Okay? So I wouldn't do that. We advise our clients, our customers, not to store credentials in the asset management system. Some of them repeatedly ask for the capability anyway, but they don't get it from us. It is just an insecure practice. Okay, network connectivity, let's just focus on this for another 2 minutes. You want to have a good network topology diagram or topology model, right? Because if you don't have that, it will be very difficult to identify all the potential attack paths to your most sacred and holy systems. Unfortunately, many organizations don't have good network topology maps, and this is where Excel's weird brother comes in. The weird brother is Visio. If you think that your Visio diagram that you call a network topology diagram actually is a network topology diagram, you are mistaken. It is not. It comes with the same flaws as the Excel spreadsheet. It's incomplete, it's outdated, and it cannot be maintained in a sustainable manner because it requires manual labor. Now, once that you do have an asset management system, the network topology is drawn from the configuration data automatically. Network topology is in your switch configuration. So this is where the asset management system can read it from. It can be pulled from the switch configuration, and then you can get a realistic, nice, fancy topology map that you can actually build on. And then there is this nasty thing with the additional metadata. And before you are getting afraid that now it becomes boring, let me motivate you with telling you that the most value you're going to get out of an asset inventory and from asset management is in the metadata. So it's really important to focus on these. The metadata is where all the device details tie into use cases, such as OT security. So some of the data we need for, and I'll get back to the metadata, trust me. Some of the problems that we see in that space is a methodology or a nomenclature for identifying devices and systems. So for identifying devices, why is this a problem? Because most people would assume, well, I got my IP address or I got my host name. Not in my factory, because we're having all these duplicate IP addresses. We're using duplicate network addresses. Can you imagine how many networks, even within one site, within one factory, use the network address 192.168.0.0? Everybody does that, for a good reason. But that tells us already that the IP address is not a good candidate for an identifier. So this is what you have to know right away. You cannot use that as an identifier. You need something else. What about MAC addresses? Yes, got it. We have find something that is globally unique. No, unfortunately not. MAC addresses are not globally unique. Let me give you 2 examples of where you run into duplicate MAC addresses. First example is redundant devices, such as network switches, PLCs, etc. They are using identical MAC addresses. Second area where you always run into duplicate MAC addresses is virtualization. So your VM server will just toss out MAC addresses just like that, just like pizza. Doesn't care, doesn't verify if the MAC address, it doesn't obtain the MAC address from this international standards organization. You don't have, usually, most of you don't have a consistent nomenclature for identification. What does that mean? In some industries, it is suggested and supposed that you do have a system for identifying devices. A good example would be the nuclear industry. It is simply assumed that in the nuclear space, every single device does have a unique identifier. And that works to some extent. So, for example, anybody has ever in a nuke plant? One? That's not enough. So the funny thing is you walk into this environment and on pretty much every valve, like, you know, there is a connector here and that's a valve, and there's this little sign on there, and it tells you the identifier of that valve, and then you can look it up in the documentation, etc. And that works for some OT devices, but not for all. This is what we have seen. So that's a practical issue that hasn't been solved yet. So my message here is for all of you who are considering to, at some point in time, introduce an asset inventory and an asset management system. And then let me share you this piece of insight. Everybody in this room will use an asset inventory and asset management system. Some just take a little longer. The pain still isn't big enough. But everybody of you, every organization will use such a system, because otherwise you will simply drown in digital complexity. So it's not just even about all the hackers out there, it's about the digital complexity. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to listen to all these BS marketing talks about Industry 4.0 and the digital transition. Yes, it is getting more complex, but everybody in this room should be able to count one and one together and identify we're going to be screwed if we don't have a decent database and system on how to maintain all these devices and their configurations, etc. So, what do you need to know? You need to have a system in place where you can identify location. And that system, that nomenclature, should include things like the specific building where this device is located in, the floor, the room, and ideally also the cabinet where a device is located. At some point in time, you or somebody else will to physically need to locate this device, if only to update a firmware that cannot be updated via the network. You know, cases like this still exist. And if you think about incident response, etc., it would also be very convenient if you would be able to know the exact location of compromised devices. So funny enough, many organizations don't have such a nomenclature in place, even though at the end of the day it is only an act of willpower. There is no science involved in establishing such a nomenclature. It is an act of willpower. But as we all know, especially in large organizations, this comes with its own set of problems. You need to get the buy-in from so many other departments. Everybody needs to agree on this nomenclature, which only works if it is used consistently. That's the catch here. Then you would like to see things like system association. So this particular PLC, to which machine does it belong? To which aggregate? To which plant system does it belong? What does it actually do? What is its role? And now we are getting to process association and criticality. If you don't know the process function of such a device, you cannot assess its criticality, or in other words, the cost of consequence. Okay? And if you cannot do that, save me with your talk about risk. You have to put meat on the bone. You have to be able to point out, well, if this thingy, Mr. CEO, if this gets compromised, we are screwed, and I can tell you why. And I have my buddy Bob here from engineering, and he has been telling me this for over a year. Bob, please make your speech now. So this is how it goes. You have to put meat on the bone. You have to make it credible with data. And different from IT, and in IT, an IT administrator, a network administrator, can already tell you about criticality and cost of consequence. And that's different in OT. And this is why the engineers are our best friends. If you're not best friends with the engineers, you will have a very hard time making a difference in OT security. And then we have a couple of use cases like asset management, what is the rationale? How can we move things in the direction that we desire? The use cases would be change management as an example, obsolescence management, audits, and vulnerability management. Just to give you an idea what an asset management system gives you, this is a vulnerability map, something like a 3D heat map, where you see all the vulnerabilities that infect your installed base. Every object in that diagram represents one specific CVE. The size of the rectangle shows you how many devices are affected, and the color is represents the CVSS base core. The most interesting thing is some of these objects have a third dimension, and that is criticality. Okay, so here you see, well, we have a bunch of devices for this specific CVE that are qualified as critical. The bottom line is, when it comes to vulnerability management, of one of the use cases for asset management, it's all about triage. You will be totally overwhelmed with vulnerabilities. I mean, you are already, but you don't know it yet. Once that you get the visibility, you will be totally overwhelmed. And the biggest question is, from those 100,000 of vulnerabilities that I am pestered with, which ones should I mitigate first? So you have to do some triage, and this is where an asset management system can guide you, because it is not going to show you only the CVSS base cores, it's also going to show you which vulnerabilities affect critical systems. We don't have enough time to talk about baselining. Here, this is my bottom line for today's talk. If you don't know what you have, you cannot know your risk. And unfortunately, this is a position that most people are still in. You cannot know your risk. So save me your risk equations, etc., and all your fancy talk about risk, if it's at the end of the day all based on a hunch, nothing but a hunch. You need the data. And if you cannot manage what you have, you cannot manage your risk. Don't talk about risk management when so far you failed to prove that you actually have some leverage on system configuration. In other words, risk management implies change management. It's like your OT security capability. Since you cannot just assume when you point out to your boss, and maybe let's just assume the boss and management agrees, yes, we have to do all that. We have to incorporate whitelisting on all our outdated Windows boxes, etc. But you don't have any change management in place. What you're going to end up with after a couple of weeks is you just don't know how many of these boxes already have whitelisting installed and how many have not. So in order to really drive the change, you need that capability, and that all comes with asset management. So we got 5 minutes left, and I hope that a couple of you guys have some good questions.
Hey, thanks very much for talking today. So you mentioned having to have a very strong base of asset management in order to pretty much do everything else in the security model. How are you applying that in this increasingly industrial IoT era where vendors are pushing a lot of the information and processing up to the cloud? How are you recommending to start wrapping around that?
Well, for the asset management system, the IoT devices are nothing special. And the IoT devices are certainly something that you want and have to see in your asset management system. Why? Because they are especially interesting for us once that we know that they are accessible by our trusty vendors, right? So in other words, we are creating a whole lot of new devices with high exposure, with links to untrusted networks. I mean, you can trust your Siemens, ABB, or whatever with all your money, but don't necessarily trust them with your OT security.
Ralph, it's Andy. I observed that your discussion was extremely humorous, albeit it was mainly of the dark humor variety. Can you say anything to people who might feel a little bit overwhelmed? Say something positive without faking it about trends you've seen that give you some hope that we're going to end up in a better place over some X amount of years. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I like the question because you may not believe it, but I am a positive guy in this regard. And I tend to fall into sarcasm sometimes because, you know, with all that Stuxnet background, 10 years ago, I was like, oh shit, you know, we are all going to hell and the Iranians will just get our ass. No, but it didn't happen. So that's good news. So far, we have been lucky for 10 years. Wow. I didn't anticipate that. But what makes me even more happy is that we are seeing substantial progress in regard to what is like the underlying theme, and that is security automation. Substantial progress, boys and girls, beyond my expectations. So what you should anticipate is that rather soon you will be able to do analytics throughout all your configurations. In other words, and please keep that in the back of your mind, OT security turns into a data science. And how fucking cool is that? Because you are laughing, I think it's very serious. I can tell you what, I'm actually surprised that nobody asked the question. What got a guy like me from Stuxnet to this apparently boring subject? I can tell you what got me here. It was the frustration of doing OT security consulting for 20 years in critical infrastructure, large-scale manufacturing, etc., and always find myself talking about these hunches. That was totally frustrating for me. You know, all the time. Like I said in my intro, well, how many devices are we talking about? That's a good question. Okay, how many networks? Maybe 50, then it's 120 or whatever. So, and this is why I have a very positive attitude and outlook today, that I can promise you one thing, this thing will be solved. Technically, conceptually, it is solved already, but there will come this phase of market acceptance. This has just started, so in a way you can say, "Oh, that's pretty cool new shit. That's new technology." Not so much, but anyhow, the first products are already there. They're already in use, and that completely changes the picture. OT security will turn into a data science. You will have all the numbers, the data that you need. If some consultants are in this room, you will no longer need to waste a useful time with figuring out what the customer actually have. You have that data already in place. You will be able to focus on the really interesting aspects of consulting, which is to interpret the data and turn that insight into something actionable. Please.
Yeah, question. You talked about how if it's not automated, it's going to end up being useless, spreadsheets and the other things. How do you start automating serial connections? I mean, I'm thinking about ArcNet controllers and Infinity loops and all those things that we bring that to the engineers and they're like, well, your inventory doesn't have everything I need on it.
Yeah, we have not. But there are two reasons for that. So first, as you will know, it's a little bit more difficult to identify these connections because your best chance would be to see, oh, wait a second, there is a module in the backplane of this PLC, and this module connects via RS-232 to this particular sensor or whatever. So it is doable, but it's a little bit more difficult. And then the simple reason why we didn't push it so far is a lack of demand. And I would just imagine that this has to do with the fact that everything has been going to be networked over the last 10 years. So what certainly you do see more frequently these days is that all these serial RS-232 devices, they are already on the network because somebody has put, for example, one of these vulnerable Moxa boxes in there, and that gives you another excellent attack vector as we have seen in Ukraine, right? And it was funny because I was just waiting for it, and then yes, there it is. Okay, so that's my answer.
And one follow-up. So there's other alternatives. So a single device might have an Ethernet on network 1, an Ethernet on network 2, and a management interface.
Yes.
How do you take all of those and correlate them together? Do you automate that sort of thing as well?
Yes. So we're with our product, we are sitting in multiple networks. Best case in every single network. The benefit is that you don't need to use a hardware appliance for that, so it's all software based. And then you certainly do see a device from its various angles. And just for those of you who are considering going down that road, that's a very, very common situation. Much more than in IT and OT, you find a lot of devices that are multi-homed, and you need to deal with that. Thank you very much, guys, and have fun throughout the day.